The air in the Ozark Mountains of 1784 was a different substance than the air we breathe today. It was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and utterly devoid of the sounds of civilization. It was an ancient air, an air that held secrets. On a frigid morning in late November, this silence was broken by a single, desperate sound, the splintering of wood. Jacob Vance, his face etched with a grim determination that had been carved there by 3 weeks of fruitless searching, brought his axe down again on the thick oak door of the abandoned cabin. The logs, hewn by his own brother's hands just a season ago, resisted. It was as if the small structure was actively trying to keep its horrifying secrets locked inside. The cabin belonged to Elias Vance, leader of a hunting party that had pushed deep into the unforgiving ridges and hollows, seeking enough pelts to see their fledgling settlement through the winter. They had been gone for 6 weeks. They were supposed to be back in 2. The search party Jacob led was not one of hope, but of grim necessity. They were looking for bodies to bury, for answers to quell the rising tide of fear back in their settlement, Providence Hollow. When the door finally gave way, groaning on its leather hinges, the scene that greeted them was not one of violence, but of an unnerving, profound stillness. A layer of dust coated everything. A half-eaten meal of dried venison sat on the table, mold creeping over it like a living shroud. But it was the object in the center of the room that made the blood of these hardened frontiersmen run cold. A single, intricately carved effigy, made of bone, twine, and dark feathers, sat on the floor. It was pointed directly at the door, a silent, macabre sentinel. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no ransacked supplies. There was only the effigy and the overwhelming feeling that they were not alone. The men had not just vanished, they had been erased. This was the beginning of a cold case that would be swallowed by the mountains themselves, a forbidden tale of a curse too dark to tell. To understand the terror that would soon consume Providence Hollow, one must first understand the year 1784. The ink on the Treaty of Paris was barely a year dry. America was a newborn nation, raw and screaming, and its people were spilling westward into lands that were both a promise and a threat. The Ozarks were the edge of the known world, a sprawling, primordial labyrinth of limestone cliffs, dense hardwood forests, and shadowy hollows where sunlight seldom touched the ground. For men like Elias Vance, a former Continental Army captain who had seen more than his share of death and desperation at Valley Forge, this untamed wilderness was a chance to build something new, something pure, away from the festering politics of the coastal cities. He, along with his younger brother Jacob, had led a small group of families into this daunting landscape, founding the settlement they hopefully named Providence Hollow. They were not naive men. They were soldiers, farmers, and trappers, accustomed to hardship. They knew the land demanded respect and a heavy price for survival. The hunting party Elias formed that October was a testament to their resolve. Besides Elias, there was Silas Kane, a man in his 50s whose face was a roadmap of hard-lived years. He was a master tracker who could read the forest like a book, a skill he'd learned from the Osage tribes he'd traded with in his youth. Then there was Thomas Finch, barely 19, eager and full of the fire of a young man desperate to prove his worth. Finally, there were the 2 Miller brothers, Isaac and Benjamin, quiet, sturdy men who worked in tandem like a well-oiled machine. 5 men in total, the most capable Providence Hollow had to offer. Their mission was simple: to venture deeper into the St. Francois Mountains than anyone from their settlement had gone before, to the legendary Elk Cradle Valley, a place rumored to be teeming with game. They carried long rifles, ample shot and powder, and the quiet confidence of men who believed they were masters of their own destiny. They could not have been more wrong. They were stepping into a story far older than their new nation, a place with its own set of unforgiving rules and its own horrifying history. The initial warnings were subtle, dismissed as the ramblings of the fearful or the superstitious. Before the party departed, they had sought advice from a reclusive trapper named Jedediah Blackwood, a man who had lived as a hermit in the Ozark foothills for 2 decades. Blackwood, with eyes that seemed to hold the darkness of the caves he sometimes slept in, listened to their plans. He drew a crude map in the dirt with a stick, marking the rivers and ridges. But when Elias mentioned the elk cradle, the old man's demeanor shifted. He spat a wad of tobacco onto the ground and emphatically scrawled an X over the valley. He spoke in a low, raspy voice of a curse, a whispering blight that haunted that specific region. He claimed the land there was soured, that it held a memory of a great sickness and a terrible betrayal from a time long before any white man had set foot there. He said the animals knew to stay away, and that the wind in the trees didn't sound right. It carried voices, he whispered, voices that promised what you desired most, only to lead you to your own undoing. Elias and his men listened politely but exchanged skeptical glances. They were men of faith and firearms, not folklore. They saw the world through a lens of practicality. A curse was just a story told to scare children and keep rival trappers out of a prime hunting ground. They thanked Jedediah for his counsel, shouldered their packs, and set off with the rising sun, their optimism a stark contrast to the old trapper's grim prophecy. The first week of their journey was uneventful, even prosperous. The weather was crisp and clear, and the hunting was good. They sent Benjamin Miller back with a cache of pelts, a sign of their success and a promise of more to come. It was after Benjamin left to return to Providence Hollow that the forest began to change. Or perhaps the forest stayed the same, and it was the men who began to notice its true nature. The change started not with a bang but with a whisper, the very thing Jedediah had warned them about. The first truly unsettling event occurred on the 8th day. Silas Kane, the veteran tracker, was the first to notice it. He paused mid-stride, holding up a hand to halt the others. The forest, which moments before had been alive with the chatter of squirrels and the calls of birds, had fallen completely and utterly silent. It was not the quiet of peace, but the charged, heavy silence of a room right after a scream. Every man felt it, a sudden pressure in the air, the primal instinct that they were being watched by countless unseen eyes. Elias scanned the dense undergrowth, his hand instinctively moving to the stock of his rifle. Thomas Finch, the youngest, nervously adjusted the strap of his powder horn, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, a solid, suffocating blanket. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. A single blue jay shrieked from a high branch, and the cacophony of the forest orchestra resumed as if nothing had happened. Silas Kane, however, remained unnerved. He knelt, examining the leaf litter. There were no tracks, no sign of a predator that could command such silence from the woods. "Never felt a stillin' like that," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "Not for a bear, not for a cat, something else." Elias, ever the steadfast leader, clapped him on the shoulder. "The woods play tricks on a man's mind, old friend. Let's keep moving. Daylight is burning." But the incident left a crack in their collective confidence. That night, huddled around their campfire, the familiar shadows cast by the dancing flames seemed deeper, more menacing. The men spoke in hushed tones, the easy camaraderie of the first week replaced by a subtle, creeping tension. Thomas Finch swore he heard something moving just beyond the ring of light, a sound like dry leaves being dragged slowly across the ground. The others heard nothing but the wind. But the seeds of doubt and paranoia had been planted in the fertile ground of the ancient forest, and the whispering blight was just beginning its macabre work. 2 days later, they found the symbols. Carved deep into the bark of a massive, ancient sycamore tree were a series of geometric patterns unlike anything they had ever seen. They were not the familiar markings of the Osage or any other known tribe. The carvings were sharp, angular, and arranged in a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. At the center of the spiral was a shape that resembled a human eye, wide and unblinking. The cuts were old, covered in moss and lichen, suggesting they had been there for a very long time. Yet upon closer inspection, Silas Kane found something that made his stomach clench. Scraped next to the ancient carvings were fresh marks, as if someone had recently retraced the lines with a sharp stone or the tip of a knife. They looked no more than a day or two old. "Who would be out this deep?" Isaac Miller asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid the carver was still nearby. The question hung in the cold air, unanswered. The presence of these symbols was profoundly disturbing. It shattered their illusion of being alone in this vast wilderness. They were not pioneers charting new territory. They were intruders in a place that already had a history, a dark and inscrutable one. That evening, as they made camp, the psychological toll began to show. Thomas Finch, who had been jumpy since the day of the Great Stilling, became obsessed with the carvings. He tried to replicate them in his journal, his hands shaking as he drew the unsettling spiral. He claimed he could hear a low humming sound coming from the woods, a sound no one else could perceive. Elias, trying to maintain morale, dismissed the carvings as the work of a long-dead people and the fresh marks as the work of a lone, mad trapper. But his words lacked conviction. The truth was, every man felt it. The forest was no longer a neutral place of resources and challenges. It felt sentient. It felt malevolent. It felt like it was closing in around them, and the strange symbols were a warning, a signpost on a road that led to a horrifying destination they were unknowingly marching towards. The curse, it seemed, did not just attack the mind. It warped the very fabric of their reality. The following day, their compasses began to fail. At first, it was a minor annoyance. The needle would quiver, pointing a few degrees off from where Sila's cane, using the sun and his own internal sense of direction, knew north to be. Elias cleaned his compass meticulously, thinking it was a simple mechanical fault. But then Isaac Miller's compass began to do the same, its needle spinning lazily before settling on a direction that was clearly wrong. By midday, all three compasses they carried were useless, spinning erratically as if caught in the grip of some unseen magnetic force. For Sila's cane, a man who had navigated these mountains his entire life, this was more terrifying than any predator. The land itself was becoming untrustworthy. The sun seemed to hang in an unfamiliar part of the sky, and familiar landmarks, a uniquely shaped rock outcropping, a lightning-scarred oak, seemed to vanish from their path. They were walking in circles, a fact that became horrifyingly clear when they stumbled upon the very same sycamore tree with the spiral carving they had left that morning. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of their composure. They were lost. Not just lost in the way a man can be in a vast wilderness, but profoundly, supernaturally lost. The forest was actively deceiving them, bending its own geography to keep them trapped within its suffocating embrace. The rational explanations were stripped away one by one, leaving only the chilling whispers of Jedediah Blackwood's warning. The land was soured. It held a memory. The men made camp in a state of quiet dread. The easy talk of profit and the future was gone, replaced by the grim, unspoken understanding of their predicament. Thomas Finch was now openly talking to himself, his eyes darting into the shadows. He claimed the humming he heard was getting louder, forming into words he couldn't quite understand. He refused to eat, convinced the food was tainted. The group was fracturing, the bonds of trust and leadership strained to their breaking point. They were no longer hunters. They were prey, and the trap had been sprung. The first one to vanish was Thomas Finch. It happened on a night when the moon was a splinter of silver in a starless, ink-black sky. A brutal, unseasonable storm had descended upon them, with winds that howled through the trees like tormented spirits and a rain so cold it felt like liquid ice. They had managed to build a crude lean-to against a rock face, a meager defense against the elements. The men were huddled together, exhausted and demoralized, their fire sputtering and hissing in the downpour. Thomas had been growing more erratic with each passing hour. He had torn out the pages of his journal where he'd drawn the spiral symbol, claiming the eye was watching him. He spoke of a woman's voice carried on the wind, promising him warmth and safety if he would just leave the fire and walk into the darkness. Elias and Silas had tried to calm him, but the young man was in the grip of a terror that was beyond their understanding. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, between the flashes of lightning, it happened. Sila's cane was jolted awake by a sudden drop in temperature beside him. The spot where Thomas Finch had been sleeping was empty. His bedroll was still there, soaked with rain, but the boy was gone. A frantic search began immediately, the men shouting his name into the roaring wind, their voices swallowed by the storm. They lit pine torches, the flames flickering wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the rocks and trees. They found a single set of barefoot tracks leading away from the shelter, heading directly into the pitch-black, storm-ravaged forest. The tracks went on for about 50 yards and then, inexplicably, they just stopped. There was no sign of a struggle, no scuff marks, no other tracks of a beast or another person. It was as if Thomas Finch had simply been lifted from the earth, plucked from existence in the middle of a steppe. The horrifying reality crashed down upon the remaining 4 men with the force of a physical blow. Thomas hadn't just wandered off. He had been taken. The whispering blight was no longer a superstition. It was a hungry, active entity, and it had just claimed its first victim. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively beautiful. The air was crisp, and sunlight streamed through the wet canopy, making the forest glitter as if it were encrusted with diamonds. But the beauty was a cruel mockery of the horror the men now faced. The disappearance of Thomas Finch had shattered their last vestiges of hope. They were no longer merely lost. They were being hunted by an enemy they could not see, fight, or comprehend. The search for the boy resumed with a desperate intensity, but it was a fool's errand. The rain had washed away any further tracks, and the forest seemed to have swallowed him whole. After hours of fruitless searching, a grim consensus was reached. Thomas was gone for good. It was at this point that the group's leadership completely fractured. Silas Kane, the pragmatist, argued they needed to abandon the hunt for Thomas and focus on their own survival. He believed their only chance was to follow the nearest creek downstream, a desperate gamble that it would eventually lead them out of this cursed territory. He spoke of the spiral carving as a marker, a boundary to a place man was not meant to enter. Isaac and Benjamin Miller, terrified and looking for any path that led away from this horror, sided with Silas. But Elias Vance, bound by his duty as captain and a deep-seated guilt over bringing the young man into this nightmare, refused. He would not leave one of his men behind, dead or alive. An ugly, heated argument erupted. Voices were raised, accusations thrown. The shared purpose that had united them was gone, replaced by fear and blame. The curse was proving to be more insidious than a mere physical threat. It was a poison that attacked the very bonds of loyalty and reason. It turned friend against friend, isolating them from within before destroying them from without. They were now 4 men, not a single unit, each consumed by his own private terror. The dark intelligence of the forest had successfully divided them, making them vulnerable, making them easy prey for whatever was to come next. Ultimately, Elia's sense of duty was overruled by the group's primal need for self-preservation. With heavy hearts and backward glances, they abandoned the search for Thomas Finch and followed Silas Kane's desperate plan. They found a small, gurgling creek and began to follow its winding path, hoping it was their thread out of the labyrinth. For a full day, they pushed themselves relentlessly, moving through the dense undergrowth with a grim, silent determination. The forest remained unnervingly quiet, the normal sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. The feeling of being watched was a constant, tangible pressure on the backs of their necks. That evening they made a cold camp, too afraid to light a fire that might attract unwanted attention. As they ate their meager rations of jerky, Isaac Miller, who had been unnaturally quiet all day, suddenly let out a strangled gasp. He pointed a trembling finger towards the creek bed, about 30 yards away. There, perched on a moss-covered boulder, was an effigy. It was constructed with a horrifying artistry, almost identical to the one they would later find in Elias Vance's cabin. It was a grotesque figure of twigs and animal sinew, adorned with the feathers of a crow and what looked like tufts of human hair. And hanging from its stick-like neck was a small, familiar object, the silver locket that Thomas Finch always wore, a gift from his mother. The discovery was a message. A clear, deliberate, and utterly terrifying statement from whatever entity haunted these woods. It was telling them that Thomas was its prize. It was telling them that they were not escaping. They were being herded. The sight of the effigy broke something in the Miller brothers. Their stoic resolve crumbled into raw, animal panic. Benjamin began to weep openly, while Isaac stared at the Macabre doll with wide, unseeing eyes, muttering prayers under his breath. The curse was no longer a whisper on the wind. It had taken a physical form, a profane idol marking their path to damnation. The discovery of the effigy marked a turning point. The horror was no longer ambiguous or confined to the realm of psychological tricks. It was tangible, intelligent, and it was toying with them. The next morning, the landscape itself seemed to conspire against their escape. The creek they had been following, their only guide, forked into three identical streams, each leading into a dark, foreboding hollow. There was no logical way to determine which was the correct path. It was another cruel trick, designed to sow further discord and despair. Silas Kane, whose confidence had been their bedrock, was now visibly shaken. He admitted he no longer recognized this part of the mountains. The ridges were wrong, the trees too old, the air too heavy. They chose a stream at random and pressed on, but the feeling of being trapped was now absolute. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a presence, an organism with a malevolent will. The line between folklore and reality was about to blur into a horrifying gray. If you find yourself drawn to these forbidden histories, consider subscribing, because the tale of Providence Hollow is a stark reminder that some legends should remain buried. The men were now living in the story Jedediah had warned them about. The whispering blight was all around them, and it was beginning to speak more clearly. Isaac Miller was the next to succumb. He began complaining of a piercing headache and a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He claimed to see fleeting movements in his peripheral vision, dark shapes that would vanish the moment he turned to look. He started whispering to himself, arguing with an unseen companion. Elias, recognizing the signs of a mind under siege, tried to keep him close, to talk him back from the brink. But the forest's influence was too strong. The curse was not a beast that stalked you from the shadows. It was a sickness of the soul that crept in through your ears and nested in your thoughts. The next day they found the cave. It was a dark, jagged mouth in the side of a limestone bluff, partially hidden behind a curtain of tangled vines. A foul metallic odor, like old blood and damp earth, emanated from its depths. They would have passed it by, but their path was blocked by a sudden, impassable gorge that hadn't been there the day before, another geographical impossibility. The cave seemed to be the only way forward, a dark throat they were being forced to enter. Silas Kane, his tracker's instincts screaming at him, argued vehemently against it. He believed it was a trap, the lair of whatever malevolent force was tormenting them. But Benjamin Miller, whose brother Isaac was now shivering with a feverish delirium, saw it as a potential shelter, a place to rest and tend to the sick man. Elias, caught between the two, made a fateful decision. They would rest at the mouth of the cave for a short while, but they would not go deep inside. As they settled down, Isaac's condition worsened dramatically. He thrashed on the ground, his eyes wide with terror, shouting at phantoms only he could see. He screamed about the man with the bone face and the woman in the trees. His words were a frantic, terrifying word salad, but one phrase he repeated over and over sent a chill down the spines of the other men. "It wants our names. Don't let it have our names." His terrified cries echoed off the rock face, a horrifying symphony of madness. Elias and Benjamin struggled to hold him down, to soothe his fevered mind, but he was lost to them, his sanity devoured by the insidious influence of the whispering blight. The cave loomed behind them, a silent observer to the man's unraveling, its foul breath a promise of the deeper horrors that lay within its stony heart. The curse was accelerating its work, breaking them down one by one. Isaac Miller's tormented screams finally subsided into exhausted, fitful moans. As dusk began to bleed through the forest canopy, casting long, distorted shadows, a new horror presented itself. Benjamin Miller, who had been tending to his brother, let out a sharp cry of alarm. He pointed to his brother's arm. There, on Isaac's skin, a series of dark, bruise-like marks were beginning to form. They were not random blemishes. They were taking shape, coalescing into the sharp, angular lines of the same spiral symbol they had seen on the sycamore tree. It was as if the curse was physically branding him, marking him as its own. The sight was so profane, so unnatural that it pushed Benjamin past his breaking point. He scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pure terror. "It's inside him. The blight is inside him," he shrieked, backing away from his own brother as if he were a venomous snake. He turned and fled, crashing blindly into the undergrowth, his terrified sobs trailing behind him. Elias and Silas yelled for him to come back, but he was gone, consumed by a panic that defied all reason. Now only two remained: Elias Vance, the beleaguered captain, and Silas Kane, the grizzled tracker whose legendary skills were useless against an enemy that rewrote the rules of reality. They were left with the dying, branded Isaac, in the shadow of a malevolent cave, with night falling fast. The situation had devolved from a crisis into a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. The group, once 5 strong and capable men, had been systematically dismantled. Thomas had been taken, Benjamin had fled into the darkness, and Isaac was being consumed from the inside out by the land itself. The weight of command, of failure, and of a creeping, supernatural dread pressed down on Elias Vance with an almost physical force. He looked from the dying man at his feet to the dark maw of the cave, and for the first time since the war, he felt true, undiluted fear. As the last light of day vanished, Isaac Miller took his final, shuddering breath. His passing was not peaceful. In his last moments his eyes snapped open, clear and lucid for the first time in days. He looked directly at Elias, his expression one of horrifying clarity. "It wears our faces," he whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Then he was gone. The spiral mark on his arm seemed to darken, a final, macabre stamp on his flesh. Elias and Silas sat in heavy silence, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the wind, which now sounded chillingly like whispers. They were out of options. Benjamin was lost to the night, and they were alone with their dead comrade. The thought of burying Isaac here in this unholy ground felt like a desecration. But the alternative, leaving his body to the elements and whatever creatures lurked in the dark, was unthinkable. With heavy hearts, they used their knives and a flattened piece of bark to scrape a shallow grave in the rocky soil at the mouth of the cave. The work was slow and grueling. Every snap of a twig in the surrounding forest made them jump. The feeling of being watched intensified, now coupled with a sense of being judged by the silent, ancient intelligence that had claimed their friend. As they laid Isaac's body in the grave, Elias said a few broken words from Scripture, but the prayer felt hollow, powerless against the primordial evil that permeated this place. They covered the grave with stones, creating a crude cairn. As they placed the last rock, a low, guttural sound echoed from deep within the cave. It was not the growl of a bear or any known animal. It was a wet, dragging sound, followed by what sounded like a soft, mocking chuckle. The two men froze, their blood turning to ice. The cave was not empty. Whatever had been tormenting them, whatever had claimed the lives and sanity of their companions, was in there, and it knew they were right outside its door. The sound from the cave sealed their fate. They could not stay where they were. To remain at the mouth of this den of horrors felt like suicide. But the thought of plunging back into the pitch-black forest, where Benjamin Miller had just fled in a state of terror, was equally terrifying. Silas Kane, his face a grim mask in the moonlight, made a startling proposition. "We go in," he said, his voice a low, steady whisper. Elias stared at him, aghast. "Into the cave? Are you mad?" Silas shook his head, his gaze fixed on the dark opening. "We've been running from it, and it's picked us off one by one. It's leading us, hurting us, the streams, the gorge. It all led us here. This is its heart. Maybe the only way out is through." His logic was born of sheer desperation, a wild gambit in a game where all the rules were stacked against them. He argued that the entity, whatever it was a creature of the forest. Perhaps its influence was weaker underground, away from the trees and the whispering wind. It was a flimsy hope, but it was the only one they had left. Elias, weighed down by the loss of his men and the failure of his leadership, saw the terrible sense in Silas's words. Their attempts to flee had only led them deeper into the trap. The only path they had not yet taken was the one that led directly into the face of their tormentor. With a grim nod, he agreed. They gathered what little they had left, their rifles, a dwindling supply of powder and shot, and a single lantern. As Elias lit the wick, the small, flickering flame pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing the entrance to the cave in stark detail. The rock around the opening was stained with dark, rust-colored streaks, and the foul, coppery smell was stronger than ever. Taking a deep breath, like men marching to their own execution, Elias Vance and Silas Kane stepped across the threshold, leaving the world of the living behind and descending into the bowels of the earth. The cave was not a simple tunnel. It was a network of tight, winding passages that twisted and turned, descending deeper into the mountain. The air grew cold and damp, thick with the smell of decay and wet limestone. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from unseen stalactites and the crunch of their own boots on the gravelly floor. The lantern cast their shadows long and grotesque on the cavern walls, making them look like hunched, fearful giants. After about 10 minutes of cautious progress, the narrow passage opened into a large, central chamber, and it was here that they found the source of the curse. The chamber was a natural cathedral of stone, but it had been converted into a profane temple. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them, spirals, unblinking eyes, and stick-like figures in poses of agony and supplication. In the center of the room stood a crude altar made from a massive, flat-topped stalagmite. And upon the altar lay the source of their dread. It was the body of Benjamin Miller. He was not merely dead. His body had been grotesquely arranged in a ritualistic pose, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles to mimic one of the figures carved on the wall. Around him were more of the feathered and bone effigies, a silent, macabre congregation. But the most horrifying detail was his face. His eyes and mouth were wide open, locked in a permanent, silent scream. And stuffed into his mouth was a fistful of dirt and roots, as if to silence him from telling the horrors he had witnessed. Elias felt a wave of nausea and rage wash over him. This was not the work of a beast. This was the work of a thinking, calculating, and sadistically cruel intelligence. Silas Kane, however, was looking past the body, his gaze fixed on the far wall of the chamber. "Elias," he whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. "Look." Elias followed his gaze. There, on the wall behind the altar, was a newer set of carvings. Among the ancient spirals and eyes were crude but unmistakable depictions of 5 men entering a forest. And one by one, each figure was being crossed out. 4 figures now had a line drawn through them. Only one remained untouched. The sight of the carvings, a chilling chronicle of their own demise, broke the last of their rational resolve. This was not just a curse. It was a predestined fate, a story written in stone before they had even arrived. The air in the chamber grew impossibly cold. The flame in their lantern sputtered violently, casting the horrifying scene in a strobing, nightmarish light. And then they heard it again. The soft, mocking chuckle echoing from a dark passage leading off from the main chamber. It was closer now, much closer. All thoughts of survival, of escape, were replaced by a singular primal instinct: fight. Elias raised his long rifle, his knuckles white. Silas did the same, standing back to back with his captain, their weapons pointed towards the suffocating darkness. "Show yourself," Elias bellowed, his voice raw with grief and fury. The only answer was another chuckle, followed by a slow, dragging sound. It was the sound of something heavy and wet being pulled across the stone floor. A shape began to emerge from the passage. It was not a beast, nor was it human. It was something in between, something that defied comprehension. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was the color of pale root flesh, and it seemed to be covered in a glistening layer of moss and grime. But its head was the epicenter of the horror. It wore a mask crafted from the skull of a large stag, its empty eye sockets seeming to burn with a malevolent, unseen light. It was the man with the bone face that Isaac Miller had screamed about in his delirium. The creature, the physical embodiment of the whispering blight, stopped just at the edge of the lantern light. It tilted its head, a gesture that was unnervingly intelligent. And then it spoke. Its voice was a dry, rasping cacophony like leaves skittering across pavement, but the words were clear. It spoke a single name: Elias. Hearing his name spoken by that abomination sent a shockwave of pure terror through Elias Vance. How could it know his name? It was impossible. Yet the sound echoed in the chamber, a personal, intimate violation. The creature took another slow, dragging step forward. It wasn't walking. It seemed to glide, its movements disjointed and unnatural. It raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed a finger tipped with a jagged shard of bone directly at Elias. "You were warned," it rasped, the voice a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all around them. "This grove does not suffer thieves. You came to steal its life, its skins. A price must be paid, a soul for a soul." The words confirmed their darkest fears. This was an ancient guardian, a protector of this specific, cursed part of the forest. They were not victims of a random haunting. They had trespassed and been found guilty. Their hunt was seen as an act of desecration. Silas Kane, reacting on pure instinct, fired his rifle. The roar of the black powder weapon was deafening in the enclosed space, and the chamber was filled with a cloud of acrid smoke. The lead ball struck the creature square in the chest with a sickening, wet thud. But the entity did not fall. It didn't even flinch. It looked down at the wound, a dark, viscous fluid oozing from the hole, and then looked back up, its head tilting with what could only be described as amusement. The soft, mocking chuckle echoed again, louder this time. The shot had done nothing. They were facing a supernatural entity, a primordial force against which their worldly weapons were as useless as children's toys. The realization was the final nail in the coffin of their hope. They were not going to fight their way out of this. They were not going to survive. They were simply the final act in a macabre play that had been performed in this unholy place for centuries. What happened next was not a battle but a slaughter. The creature moved with a speed that defied its lurching gait. It closed the distance to Silas Kane in an instant, its long arm lashing out like a whip. The bone shard on its fingertips sliced through the old tracker's leather tunic and deep into his side. Silas cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and surprise, and stumbled backward, his rifle clattering to the stone floor. Elias, seeing his friend fall, swung his own rifle like a club, aiming for the creature's masked head. The heavy maple stock connected with a sickening crack. The stag's skull mask shattered, pieces of bone flying into the darkness. But the face beneath was a horror beyond imagination. There was no face. It was a smooth, pale, featureless expanse of skin, with no eyes, no nose, and no mouth. Yet they had heard it speak, seen it look at them. The voice, the intelligence, was emanating from it through sheer force of will. The sight of that blank, impossible visage was the ultimate horror, a complete rejection of the natural order. It was a canvas onto which the mind projected its own worst fears. As Elias stood frozen in disbelief, the creature turned its full attention to him. The featureless face seemed to bore into his soul. The whispering voice filled his mind, no longer coming from the air, but from inside his own head. It wasn't just speaking to him, it was showing him things. Horrifying images flashed through his consciousness, the rotting faces of his fallen comrades, the terrified settlers of Providence Hollow succumbing to a strange sickness, his own brother Jacob finding his mutilated body. It was showing him the future it had planned, a future of unending despair originating from this single cursed place. It was offering him a choice: die here and now or take the curse with him, back to everyone he cared about. It was the most diabolical torment imaginable. This brings us back to Providence Hollow and the long, agonizing wait. 6 weeks had passed since Elias and his party were due to return. The settlement, once a bastion of hope and resilience, had become a place of quiet, mounting dread. Every day, families would gaze at the impassive wall of trees that bordered their homesteads, praying for the sight of the returning hunters. But the forest remained silent and still, a green monster that had swallowed their best men. Jacob Vance, younger than Elias but possessing the same iron will, refused to let despair take root. He organized the search party. It consisted of himself and 4 other able-bodied men, including a reluctant Jedediah Blackwood. The old trapper had emerged from his hermitage, his face grimmer than ever, stating that he knew the men were not coming back, but that some things can't be left to fester in the dark. His presence was both comforting and deeply unsettling to the other men. They followed the trail Elia's party had blazed weeks ago. For the first several days, the signs were encouraging. They found the remains of their early camps, evidence of their successful hunting. They even found the cache of pelts left by Benjamin Miller, a testament to their initial good fortune. But as they pushed deeper, following the path towards the dreaded Elk Cradle Valley, the atmosphere began to change. The trail became harder to follow. They found a campsite that had been abandoned in a hurry, a kettle still hanging over a long-dead fire. It was here they found the first personal effect, Thomas Finch's journal. They gathered around as Jacob read the entries aloud. The early pages were filled with youthful optimism, but the tone shifted dramatically. The writing grew frantic, sloppy. The last entry was a terrifying, almost illegible scrawl about a great stilling, a song in the trees, and a spiral-shaped eye that was always watching. The final words were, "She says she'll keep me warm." The journal was the first concrete evidence that something had gone terribly, horribly wrong. Jedediah Blackwood was the one who found the barefoot tracks. He knelt by the forest floor, his gnarled fingers tracing the faint impressions that had somehow survived weeks of weather. "Finch," he grunted, "ran from camp in the middle of a storm, barefoot." He pointed to where the tracks simply ended in the middle of a clearing. "And this is where it took him." He spoke with a chilling certainty, as if he were merely confirming a fact he had known all along. The other men looked at him, their faces pale. The old trapper's folklore was beginning to feel like a field guide to a nightmare they had just walked into. They pressed on, their senses on high alert, every snap of a twig making them flinch. The land itself seemed to grow sick around them. The trees were twisted into gnarled, unnatural shapes. A strange, coppery scent hung in the air, and a profound silence had fallen, the same oppressive stillness that Thomas Finch had described in his journal. They were entering the domain of the whispering blight. It was Jacob who spotted the effigy on the boulder by the creek. The sight of the grotesque doll, adorned with the locket of a boy he had known since childhood, was a physical blow. The search was no longer for survivors. It was now a grim quest for vengeance, or at the very least for understanding. What kind of man or what kind of beast would do such a thing? The question tormented Jacob, fueling a cold, hard rage that pushed him forward. Jedediah, however, seemed to understand. He touched the effigy not with fear, but with a kind of grim reverence. "A marker," he whispered, "a claim. It's telling us this soul belongs to the land now." His words offered no comfort, only a deeper, more profound sense of dread. They were not just dealing with a murderer. They were trespassing on sacred and deeply malevolent ground. The search party's journey became a descent into a living hell, a walking tour of the horrors that had befallen Elias' men. They found the place where the compasses had failed, a strange, barren patch of ground where their own needles spun uselessly. They found the shallow grave at the mouth of the cave, marked by the cairn of stones. With a sense of grim finality, they began to remove the rocks. The body they uncovered was Isaac Miller. The spiral symbol was still visible on his arm, a dark, permanent brand. But there was something else, something more disturbing. His body was covered in a fine, white, web-like fungus, a growth none of them had ever seen before. It seemed to be emanating from the ground itself, as if the cursed earth was actively consuming him. The sight was so unnatural that two of the younger men in the party turned away and were violently ill. Jedediah Blackwood examined the fungus with a detached, clinical interest. "The blight," he stated simply. "It doesn't just take your mind. It takes your body too, feeds on it, makes it part of the soil." Jacob Vance stared at the defiled remains of his friend, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The rage he had felt was now mingling with a terrifying awe. They were facing an enemy that was not just a creature, but the land itself, a conscious, hungry ecosystem of evil. He looked towards the dark opening of the cave, the foul stench of death and decay wafting out to meet them. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the answers to his brother's fate lay within that darkness. But he also knew that to enter it was to risk joining them in their macabre end. The other members of the search party were looking at him, their faces a mixture of fear and expectation. They would follow his lead, but the question was clear in their eyes. Was finding the truth worth paying the ultimate price? The decision to enter the cave was the heaviest Jacob Vance had ever made. He left two men outside to stand guard, a futile gesture against a threat they couldn't comprehend, but a necessary nod to caution. He, Jedediah, and another man named Peterson lit their torches and stepped into the oppressive darkness. The journey through the winding passages felt like a descent into the underworld. The silence was absolute, broken only by their own breathing and the drip of water that sounded like a slow, steady clock ticking towards their doom. When they entered the central chamber, the scene that awaited them was one of pure, unadulterated horror. The torchlight flickered across the profane altar, illuminating the desecrated body of Benjamin Miller, his face locked in that silent scream. Peterson let out a choked cry and stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth. But Jacob and Jedediah were drawn to the walls, to the horrifying story carved in the stone. They saw the chronicle of the hunters' arrival and their systematic demise. And then they saw the fresh carving, the one that depicted 5 more stick figures, their own search party, approaching the cave. One of the figures, presumably Isaac Miller left outside, had already been marked with a fresh, oozing sap that dripped down the stone like a tear of blood. It was a clear, terrifying message. The entity knew they were here and it had already added them to its ledger. The story was not over, they had simply walked into the next chapter. The truth they had sought was a curse in itself. It was the knowledge that they were doomed, that their fate was to be the next verse in this ancient, horrifying song of death. The air grew thick, the torches sputtered, and from the darkness of a far passage they heard the soft, mocking chuckle of the thing that had been waiting for them. Jedediah Blackwood reacted with a speed that belied his age. He grabbed Jacob by the arm, his grip like iron. "We leave, now," he hissed, his eyes wide with a fear that Jacob had never seen in the old man before. "We saw what we came to see. Their story is written. We don't have to let it write ours." He started pulling Jacob towards the entrance, but Jacob was frozen, his gaze locked on the shattered remnants of a stag's skull mask on the floor near the altar. Beside it lay his brother's rifle, the stock splintered and broken. Elias had been here, he had fought here. "My brother," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with a grief so profound it was almost paralyzing. "I have to know." "He's gone, son," Jedediah insisted, his voice a desperate plea. "They're all gone. This place is a stomach and it's digesting them. If we stay, we'll be next." The dragging sound began again from the far passage, closer this time, more deliberate. The entity was coming. The choice was stark and immediate. Flee and live with the horrifying, unanswered questions, or stay and face certain death for a truth that was already written in stone. This moment, this terrible decision, is where the coherent part of the story ends. The official account, pieced together from the terrified testimonies of the survivors, becomes fractured, a mosaic of panic and trauma. The search party did not emerge from that cave unscathed. They brought the curse of Providence Hollow back with them, not as a fungus or a spirit, but as a madness, a shared and horrifying memory that would poison their settlement from the inside out. The details of their escape from that chamber of horrors are a testament to the sheer, unreasoning terror the whispering blight could inflict. The escape was a blind, stumbling panic. According to what little Peterson could later recall before his mind completely fractured, Jedediah managed to drag the shell-shocked Jacob Vance out of the main chamber. As they fled through the twisting passages, the whispering voice filled their minds. It didn't shout or threaten. It spoke to each of them personally, calmly, using their deepest fears and regrets as weapons. It reminded Peterson of his young daughter, who had died of fever the previous winter, telling him she was cold and alone in her grave. It taunted Jacob with images of Elias being torn apart, whispering that it was his fault for not searching sooner. It dug into their minds like a parasite, feeding on their sorrow and guilt. When they burst out of the cave and into the fatting daylight, the 2 men they had left as guards were gone. In their place were 2 more of the macabre, feathered effigies, swaying gently in the breeze. The entity could move outside the cave, it was everywhere. They didn't stop to rest or regroup. They ran. They ran blindly through the woods, thorns and branches tearing at their clothes and skin, their lungs burning, driven by a terror so absolute that it superseded all other thoughts. They ran for a full day and a night, not daring to look back, convinced that the featureless face was right behind them. When they finally stumbled back into the relative safety of Providence Hollow 2 days later, they were not the same men who had left. Peterson was catatonic, his eyes vacant, muttering about a man with a bone face. Jacob Vance was grimly silent, his face aged 10 years, his eyes holding the haunted look of a man who has stared into the abyss. Jedediah Blackwood, the man who knew the most, said the least. He simply packed his meager belongings and vanished back into the wilderness, but not before delivering one final, chilling warning to the settlers. "Seal it," he had rasped. "Bury the path, never speak its name. Let the forest have it. Some things are better left lost." The return of the survivors was not a relief for Providence Hollow. It was the beginning of the end. The terror they brought back with them was more infectious than any plague. Peterson's madness deepened until he had to be locked in his own cabin, where he would scream for hours at unseen horrors until his voice gave out. Jacob Vance became a recluse, a ghost in his own settlement, refusing to speak of what he had seen in the cave. But his silence was louder than any scream. The settlers, starved for answers, filled that silence with their own whispered fears. The story of the whispering blight, the man with the boned face, and the cave of carved horrors spread through the community like wildfire. The forest that had once been their source of life was now seen as a source of death, a looming, monstrous entity waiting to devour them. The search for answers had only led to more terrifying questions. This channel is dedicated to unearthing these dark truths. Join us on this journey by hitting the like button if you believe some places are truly cursed. The curse had followed them home. Crops began to fail, inexplicably rotting in the fields. A strange sickness, a wasting blight, swept through their livestock. Children began having night terrors, all describing the same thing. A tall, thin man with a white face and no eyes, standing at the edge of the woods, watching them. The optimism and resolve that had built Providence Hollow evaporated, replaced by a pervasive, suffocating paranoia. Neighbors began to suspect one another, whispering that some had brought the evil back with them, that the blight was now walking among them in human form. The community rotted from the inside out, consumed not by a monster, but by the fear of one. What truly happened to Elias Vance and Silas Kane in that cave? The search party found Elias' broken rifle and a large pool of dried blood, but they never found a body. Their fates remain the most disturbing and unresolved part of this entire horrifying case. One theory, the most straightforward, is that they were simply killed by the creature, their bodies dragged away to some deeper, undiscovered part of the cavern system to be consumed or used in some profane ritual. This is the most likely scenario, a brutal and tragic end to their ordeal. But a darker, more macabre possibility is hinted at by the final, frantic words of Isaac Miller. "It wears our faces." Some of the more chilling interpretations of the legend suggest that the entity, the guardian of the grove, is a shapeshifter, a mimic. It doesn't just kill its victims, it absorbs them, takes their knowledge, their form. Is it possible that the featureless face was a blank slate, waiting to be imprinted with a new identity? This theory posits that one of the men, either Elias or Silas, did not die in that cave. Instead, they became the new guardian, their soul and identity consumed and repurposed by the ancient entity. The protector of the grove must be replaced every so often, and the hunting party was merely an audition. This would explain how it knew Elias' name. It wasn't reading his mind. It was reading the mind of a previous victim, a soul it had already absorbed. The curse of the whispering blight, then, is not just death, but an eternal, horrifying servitude, becoming the very monster that destroyed you. This disturbing theory casts the final events in an even more sinister light. The whispering voice in the cave offered Elias a choice: die or take the curse back with him. What if this was not a psychological trick, but a literal offer? What if, in a moment of ultimate despair, seeing no other way to save his settlement from the entity's wrath, Elias Vance made an unthinkable sacrifice? Perhaps he accepted the curse, agreeing to become the new guardian, to be the monster, in exchange for the entity leaving Providence Hollow alone. His final act as a human would be one of profound, selfless love, dooming himself to an eternity of monstrosity to protect his family and friends. This would transform him from a tragic victim into a horrifying, tragic hero. This interpretation adds a layer of Shakespearean tragedy to the tale. The broken rifle found by Jacob was not a sign of his brother's death, but of his transformation, the casting off of his old human life. The entity did not need to follow the search party back. It had a new agent, a new face to wear, one that knew the way to Providence Hollow intimately. The subsequent haunting of the settlement was not the work of the old entity, but of the new one, the thing that was once Elias Vance, now bound by the rules of its new existence, unable to stop itself from terrorizing the very people it had sought to save. The curse was absolute. Even an act of love could not break it. It could only change the face of the monster. The decline of Providence Hollow was swift and total. Within a year of the search party's return, the settlement was all but abandoned. The constant fear, the failed crops, and the pervasive sickness drove the families away one by one. They scattered to the winds, taking with them the fractured, terrifying story of what had happened in the mountains. They spoke of it in hushed tones, a forbidden history that they tried to forget but could never truly escape. The last family to leave was the Vances. Jacob, a broken man, finally packed his wagon, unable to bear living in the shadow of the forest that had claimed his brother and destroyed his dream. The town of Providence Hollow was left to be reclaimed by the wilderness. The cabins rotted, the fields grew wild, and the forest slowly crept back in, erasing all evidence that humanity had ever tried to put down roots there. The place became a ghost story, a warning to other settlers pushing into the Ozarks. The area around the Elk Cradle Valley and the Cursed Cave was marked on crude maps as banned or dead land, a place to be avoided at all costs. The story of the hunters who never returned became a piece of macabre local folklore, its details shifting and changing with each telling, but its core of terror remaining potent. The Whispering Blight had won. It had successfully defended its territory, not by killing the intruders, but by making them carry the seeds of its horror back to their own world, proving that the most resilient curse is one that lives in the minds of men. What was the entity? What was the true nature of the Whispering Blight? The legend offers no easy answers, only layers of chilling speculation. Was it a literal demon, a spirit of the damned as some of the more religious settlers believed? Or was it something more primal, an elemental force of nature, a genius loci, the sentient consciousness of the forest itself, angered by the intrusion of men with their iron and their greed? This interpretation paints the entity not as evil, but as a natural predator defending its habitat, using psychological warfare, the only weapon that could defeat the apex predator, man. Another, more scientific, if equally disturbing, explanation could lie in the realm of biology. The strange fungus found on Isaac Miller's body, the blight, could be a cordyceps-like organism, unknown to science. Certain types of cordyceps fungi are known to infect insects, taking control of their minds and bodies, forcing them to climb to high places to better spread their spores. What if the Whispering Blight was a far more advanced version of this, one that had evolved to infect mammals, even humans? The whispers and hallucinations could be auditory and visual distortions caused by the fungus attacking the brain. The madness was not supernatural, but a symptom of a horrifyingly real infection. This would mean the entity in the cave was not a spirit, but perhaps the host, or fruiting body of this vast fungal network, the intelligent, central mind of a subterranean organism that viewed the men as a threat to its existence. This fungal theory provides a chillingly plausible framework for the events. The compass's failing could be explained by unusual magnetic iron deposits in the area, a geological anomaly. The feeling of being watched, the paranoia, the auditory hallucinations, all could be the early neurological symptoms of exposure to airborne spores, perhaps released by the effigies or the disturbed soil. The entity in the cave, with its pale, root-like skin, could be a symbiotic organism, a creature that lives in partnership with the fungus, its guardian. Or, in the most horrifying version of this theory, it could be a previous human victim, so completely consumed and mutated by the fungal infection that it had become a new life form entirely, a zombie in the truest sense of the word, a puppet of the ancient, intelligent blight. This would make the curse a biological contagion. The search party, by entering the cave and disturbing the bodies, could have become infected themselves. The madness and sickness that destroyed Providence Hollow wasn't just psychological trauma. It was the first stage of a literal plague, a horrifying infection they carried out of the woods. The story becomes a piece of early American eco-horror, a tale of pioneers accidentally disturbing a dormant, intelligent, and utterly alien ecosystem with terrifying consequences. The legend of the Whispering Blight is not a ghost story. It is a quarantined zone, banned not by superstition, but by a biological threat that the settlers of the 18th century had no way to understand or combat. For over 2 centuries, the story remained just that, a story, a dark piece of Ozark folklore told around campfires. Providence Hollow was swallowed by the forest, its location lost to time. The cursed valley was avoided by locals, its reputation ensuring it remained an untouched piece of wilderness. The cold case of the vanished hunters was officially forgotten, buried under layers of time and skepticism. But in 1998, a group of spelunkers, exploring an unmapped cave system in the St. Francois Mountains, broke through a wall of calcite. They stumbled into a large, isolated chamber that had been sealed off from the outside world for centuries. The air was stale, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. And in the center of the chamber they found it, a crude altar made from a stalagmite. On the floor around it were the scattered, decayed remains of several human skeletons, dating back to the late 18th century. Mingled with the bones were the remnants of long rifles, rusted knife blades, and brass buttons from colonial-era clothing. The walls of the cave were covered in strange, spiral-like carvings. The spelunkers had, entirely by accident, rediscovered the profane temple of the Whispering Blight. The discovery sent a shockwave through the local historical and archaeological communities. For the first time, there was physical evidence to corroborate the terrifying legend. The bones were carefully excavated and analyzed. They were identified as the remains of at least 4 adult males, consistent with the members of Elias Vance's party. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of malnutrition and extreme trauma, with cut marks on the bones suggesting ritualistic dismemberment. The most disturbing discovery, however, came from the soil samples taken from the cave. They contained the spores of a previously unknown species of fungus. Under laboratory conditions, this fungus exhibited highly unusual properties. It was neurotropic, meaning it was drawn to and affected nerve tissue. It was also found to be psychoactive, capable of producing powerful auditory and visual hallucinations in mammals. The scientists had found the biological agent of the Whispering Blight. But one mystery remained. Among the jumbled skeletons, one body was missing. The remains of 4 of the 5 original hunters were accounted for: Thomas Finch, whose body was likely never recovered from the woods, and the Miller brothers and Silas Kane in the cave. But there was no trace of Elias Vance. His broken rifle was there, but his bones were not. This glaring absence from the archaeological record breathes new life into the darkest part of the legend. If he was killed with the others, where is his body? His absence lends a horrifying credence to the theory that his fate was different, that he was not merely a victim of the curse, but that he had somehow become part of it. The rediscovered cave, with its silent, stony testament to the horror that transpired, does not solve the mystery of the hunters who never returned. It deepens it. It grounds the supernatural folklore in a terrifyingly tangible reality, and leaves the most important question chillingly unanswered. What truly happened to Elias Vance? Today, the location of the cave is kept a closely guarded secret by the state's Archaeological Survey to prevent amateur ghost hunters and thrill seekers from disturbing the site. It is, in a modern sense, banned territory once again. The Ozark Mountains are a place of breathtaking beauty, a popular destination for hiking, camping, and enjoying nature. Millions of people visit every year, walking the trails, completely unaware of the dark histories that lie hidden just beneath the surface, in the deep, unlit hollows and forgotten caves. But for those who know the story of Providence Hollow, the forest looks different. The whisper of the wind through the pines sounds less like a melody and more like a voice. The deep shadows under the rock bluffs seem to harbor more than just darkness. The legend of the hunters who never returned serves as a chilling reminder that we are never truly masters of the wilderness. We are merely guests, and sometimes we overstay our welcome in places that have their own ancient rules and their own eternal guardians. The story is a cold case not just because the victims vanished, but because the perpetrator was something that can never be brought to justice. It is the land itself, the memory held within the rock, the soil, and the ancient trees. A primordial force that was disturbed from its slumber in 1784, and for a brief, horrifying period, showed a small group of settlers the true meaning of a curse. The final, and perhaps most macabre, piece of the puzzle is a detail often omitted from retellings of the legend, a footnote in the historical record that is too disturbing for most to contemplate. When Jacob Vance finally abandoned the ghost settlement of Providence Hollow, he took one thing with him from his brother's cabin: the strange, feathered effigy the search party had found sitting in the center of the room. He didn't know why he took it. Perhaps he saw it as the last remaining link to his brother, a piece of evidence in a crime that had no resolution. He kept it wrapped in an oilskin cloth, locked away in a small wooden chest. Years later, as an old man living hundreds of miles away, he finally opened the chest. The story goes that the effigy had changed. It had not decayed. Instead, the small, carved wooden face at its center, which had once been a crude, anonymous representation, now bore a striking, unmistakable resemblance to his brother Elias. It was his face, etched in miniature, with an expression of profound and eternal agony. The curse had not ended in the cave. A piece of it had been carried out, a piece of Elias' soul trapped within that profane object, a final, horrifying message from the whispering blight. The story of what Jacob did with the effigy after that is lost to history, and perhaps that is for the best. Some secrets are too dark to be unearthed, and some curses are never truly broken. In the end, the horrifying case of the hunters who never returned remains an open wound in the history of the Ozarks. It is a story with no heroes and no clear villains, only victims. It is a testament to the fragility of the human mind when faced with the unknown and the unknowable. Whether the whispering blight was a spirit, a fungus, or a madness born of isolation and fear, the result was the same. 5 men vanished from the face of the earth, a settlement was wiped from the map, and a dark legend was born that continues to haunt the misty hollows of the mountains to this day. The next time you find yourself in a deep, quiet forest, far from the reassuring sounds of the modern world, listen closely. Listen to the wind in the trees, to the silence between the birdsongs. And ask yourself what ancient stories that forest might be telling, and pray that it does not decide to tell you yours. The case of Elias Vance and his men is a forbidden history, a chilling reminder that there are still places in this world that do not belong to us, places where the veil between reality and nightmare is terrifyingly thin. And sometimes, when you stare too long into the darkness of the past, something from that darkness stares back.